Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for coming to Capital Bass Fishing again. And today I wanted to talk about the frog. Today I want to talk about frog fishing. And the reason I want to talk about frog fishing is because I think when I first started fishing, I really shied away from using frogs. I think the first thing that kept me from using the frogs was my equipment. And we'll talk about the equipment here in a minute, which is very, very important when fishing frogs. There's a couple of aspects that I want to cover today in dealing with frogs. I mostly want to focus on how to choose a frog to fish with. And then I want to talk about the equipment you might use to fish the frog. Then I want to talk about the actual function of fishing for the frog, like how you would fish them in the water, what you're looking to do, how you react when a frog hits, all that stuff. So when I first started fishing, it was pretty embarrassing because I was using spinning gear and I used the whopper plopper all the time. That's the only thing I would use. So when I got to a pond that had a lot of scum and cheese on top, game over. It was either plastic worm or whopper plopper. That was it, which is fine, actually. That's probably could be 90% of most people's arsenal, and you're going to be very successful just using those two baits. But I soon came to realize that the whopper plopper kind of overstayed its welcome in some of the ponds that I fish in, to the point where I wasn't getting bites or strikes anymore. When I get to some of these cheesy, gross ponds, you have a couple of choices. You can either punch down through it, or you could fish on top of the scum, which can be kind of fun. There's actually no better bite, in my opinion, in fishing than a frog bite and largemouth bass. I think it's one of the most exciting strikes you're going to get because the lengths at which these fish will go to eat that bait is pretty phenomenal sometimes. They'll knock it straight up out of the water. They'll come out from underneath tree limbs. They'll just come barreling up through weeds you wouldn't even think they could live in. But if you look at a fish and you look at its hydrodynamics, I guess you would call it, and how torpedo shaped and how they can just move through the water and they're so slippery. I mean, even when you hold them, they slip out of your hand. So imagine that type of a body swimming around in grass and weeds. It's really not a hard thing for them to do. So I don't think you should ever be intimidated to fish a frog in the heavy, thick weeds because that's where bass live and that's what they like. So it brings you to making a decision of which frog to use. So really there's only a couple categories of frogs, and we'll go through those. And then from there, honestly, I think picking a frog is as simple as pick the one that you think looks the coolest. Whatever you think looks cool and you think is going to work, grab it and start using it because it's really a confidence thing. And that's something that I've really noticed when Pat and I fish. He's got his favorite frog. I've got my favorite frog. When the chips are down and we want to land fish, I'll see him tie on his favorite and I'll tie on my favorite. And it won't matter what's happening or what the conditions are. It just seems like we defy all the laws of, logic when it comes to fishing and maybe dark and light and overcast and sunny and bright. We just throw on the frog we like the best because we're so used to using that frog. We trust our hookup, we trust our hook set, and we just trust what we do when we fish those particular frogs. And we'll talk about those in a second. So let's just talk about real quick category. I'm going to pick up, first of all, this is a basic generic frog. And this one would be one that you would see maybe from a company called Live Target or Lunker Hunt. This is a knockoff cheapo, and it just looks like a little torpedo pod. And basically these frogs have similar attributes across all the frog lines. The hooks come up and lay next to the body. That is to keep the frog from getting weeds all stuck into the hooks. It keeps it weedless, and it rides across the grass in a way that's going to keep it from getting all mangled up. And then the body is hollow. So these are all hollow body frogs, the ones I'm talking about. These are top water hollow body frogs. The bodies collapse when a fish comes to strike these frogs. So a couple of attributes would be their hollow body. The hooks come up and they kind of face pronated upwards, and the body collapses and the hook set happens like that. And that's pretty much every one of these frogs right here. Every single one of them has the same attribute in that way. They might have different ways that they lay against the body. They might have different angles, whatever. And people will say this matters, that matters. Honestly, I think when it comes to picking a frog, pick the one you like the most, the one you feel comfortable with, the one you think that's going to work, and use that one. So this is your basic frog, right? But let's say you wanted to swim a frog across the water that acted kind of like a whopper plopper. You know, like a whopper plopper will sit there and go plop, 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 plop. And a buzz bait will buzz and splash. Sometimes the fish react to a moving creature more than they do a stationary object. So that's where your sputtering and kicking and flipping type frogs would come into play. Now, this is a frog made by a company called Scum Frog. Now, there's new versions of this, but this is a classic de facto kicker leg frog. So you could go fish this in the weeds. You could leave it stationary and the legs would sit there and wiggle around in the water. But as soon as you started reeling it in across the top of the water, these are going to kick and sputter and give you kind of that whopper plopper bubble behind the frog. And so if you wanted to try to catch fish on the move, you could do it with this. There's also a company called Teckle Sprinkler Frog, and Teckle makes a frog, and this one I kind of adapted to my own version. I put 2 legs on here, and these have paddle tail swim bait stems mounted on the bottom, and these will kick. But Teckle Sprinkler Frog makes the Sprinkler Frog, which has a single moving paddle tail type thing on the back, which gives you a very similar sound to the whopper plopper. And I would say if you like the sound of the plop of the whopper plopper, the Teckle Sprinkler Frog is going to give you the best sound. And those are really the 2 that I have. And then you have clackers. You can hear this one right away. I mean, it doesn't take much to make noise on that one. This is also made by Teckle, the company, and same type body, and it has a clacker, so that's going to be handy. Let's say you get up on top of some grass where it might not be easy for the bass to see through or see the object. You could bring them from farther away with this little tassel. Also, you could throw it in the middle of the water and let it just dangle and reflect light. Sometimes they'll react to that. This Kyara frog that I have has 2 blades on it. This happens to be a special version of this frog, but we're going to talk about this frog generally in this body style without these blades. But there's all different ways to make noise. And then, of course, there's going to be popping frogs. And that's frogs that have a concave face that act like a popper. So you could have frogs that act like a whopper plopper. You could have frogs that act like a popper in open water. So you could throw this popping frog up on the grass. Once you get off the grass, you could sit on the edge and just pop. Pop. And it's not going to make like a real high pitch pop. It's more like a bloop, bloop. It's a terrible sample, but that's what it sounds like. It's more of a bloop than a pop. But you've got a couple different popping frog brands. This is also made by Scum Frog. This is one of my buddy custom painted. He thought it was this way, but he put the frog pattern on the bottom, which I think works fine. I've been getting good strikes on this one lately. And then I have one made by Ema. This is my favorite frog. It's the Ema Dabeat, D-A-B-E-A-T. I don't know how you say it. Ema is the company. This is a little tiny peanut. This thing's tiny. I love it because I fish a lot of ponds. It catches fish large and small and has a really easily collapsing body, but the hooks are a little tinier. Pat gets frustrated with this frog a little bit. He can't walk it. And walking is when you work the frog back and forth, which can come in handy. But this is my go-to. This is when I am down and I just want to get a fish on the end of my rod and reel it in. This is the one I'll use because I just have faith in this frog. And it is a popping frog. It has a little teeny popping mouth. It's more of a spitting frog. And that's kind of how this frog works for me. I'll give it a 1-2, let it sit, and I'll give it a 1-2, and then, just kind of work it that way. I don't really walk this one that much. The other thing I do with this frog, usually the legs on this frog are really long. Like I have this Iobi frog over here. You see how long these legs are? Normally this frog has legs that same length. And when those legs get in the water, they sit there and swirl and just do their own thing. And you don't even have to move the frog. And that's something I like about this I'm a frog is I can throw it out there and let it sit and those legs will sit there and do work. And it's just dead stuck in the water. I'm not even moving it. And sometimes you'll just get blown up just by sitting there. And then if you want to have something that has legs, there's a lunker hunt where it has like a lifelike frog leg type thing, even with the little paddle feet. Which this one, I don't know why, it just feels like a toy. but some people love these. I'm kind of like, eh. I like the lunker hunts that have this body, but have like a traditional tassel, back end. So I could pull these legs off and pull some, grass through there and use this frog a different way if I wanted to. But there's all different ways you can do it. There's all different things that work. You want to pay attention to the types of frogs or fish that are in that water. You want to pay attention to the types of cover that's in that water. And you want to make your selection based on your best guesses to what you think will work. And then ultimately pick the one you like and the one you're comfortable with, because you want to take out any types of doubt. You don't want to be fishing a lure that you don't think's going to work, and it's just not going to work, and this thing's not working. I think I should get another one. It's just not working. And all of a sudden, whammy, you get slammed in the water. Your head casing because you don't think the color's right. The strike of your life just happened. You're caught off guard. You almost drop your rod. You go to set the hook. You're way too late or way too early, and you miss it because you're thinking about the color being wrong instead of focusing. And that's where I'm going to get to the gear. Let's talk about some of the gear for these frogs. And I'll walk through some of these frogs and their features here in a minute. But when you're fishing frogs, I think you need to be fishing a bait caster, like it or not. You can do it on a spinning rod, but you better have some good line and a really stiff rod. And the cards are stacked against you. The frog success is based on a good hook set. That's really the bottom line. And the hook set consists of two things: strength and timing. And they both have to be good or you're going to miss. When that frog first gets nailed on top of the water, typically that fish grabs it and turns down. And he's heading down with it or sideways or doing something. By the time he hits and turns, you probably will have some slack in the line or something going on. You want to reel out that slack, and then you just want to set that hook. Now you want to set the hook, and I'm not going to try to tell people go from 6 to 12 or from 8 to 2 or whatever on their hook set, because when I first started setting hooks with frogs, people were like, oh, you set the hook like, no offense to women, but they're like, hey, you set the hook like a girl, you set the hook like a little pansy. And they're like, you really need to give it the screws. And I just really didn't know what I was doing when I first started fishing with frogs. These are big hooks. I mean, look at these things. These hooks are really big and they're really thick and they're wiry. And you really have to yank and penetrate to get this hook into the fish's mouth, or else you're going to get it just barely hooked. You're going to fight it for a second, get super excited, and you're going to lose that fish. And then you're not going to catch that fish again. Once a fish has felt the hooks of that frog, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to get them twice. Okay, so gear. Bait caster, doesn't really matter what gear ratio. I like to stay around 7, somewhere in that range, because I want to be able to take up slack and pull on that fish pretty quickly. You can fish a 6 or you can fish an 8 or 9. One of my favorite frog rods is a 9, is the Speed Demon Cast King, and I can really take up some line. But it's not always necessary, so you just want to have like a 7 gear or higher, I think. I would fish, if you're fishing ponds and structure, no less than 30-pound braid. People go as high as 60 and 50. I think that's a little much, but depends on where you're at and what you're up against. If you're hitting heavy structure and heavy things and you've got a beastly rod and you're catching big fish, then maybe 50's the ticket. But I get away with 30 just fine. It gives me a little better casting distance. And then that brings in another topic to talk about. I don't think you want to fish frogs too far away. They can be heavy and you can bomb cast some of these sometimes. Pat has a saying that there's a long cast and then there's fishable distance. If you're so far out with your line and you don't have a tall enough, long enough rod and the ability to hook set the way you should, then you're not really fishing a fishable distance. And I know sometimes you get on a pond and you see that perfect spot and you're like, if I could just cast to that spot, I know there's a fish. And I can't tell you how many times I've made it with my frog all the way out there, and I'm getting ready and I'm trying to pull out the slack, and as I'm messing around getting ready to start working the frog, I get a hit, and then I go to set it and it's just too far away and I can't get any meat on it, and it just doesn't work out. So I think what you want to do is set yourself up for a little shorter cast, leave a little less line in the water, try to really hit ambush points. Think about points or where grass stops and starts, underneath tree limbs, up near banks, cutouts in the grass. If you know where the depth starts to get deeper or shallower in certain areas, you can work those points and those transition phases. Really just try to think like a fish. Just say, if I was a fish and I was waiting for somebody to come by, I think I'd be hiding right next to that log. So you want to not cast right on top of that log, maybe beyond the log, and then pull up to it and then have it sit quietly up next to the log and try to catch the fish that way. So gear, bait caster, 30-pound braid, at least medium heavy rod to maybe just a heavy rod. Usually like a medium heavy fast or a heavy fast is a good size for your fishing rod. And I'd say nothing less than 7 feet. I have a 7.1 frog rod and a 7.3 frog rod. And I know people that fish 7.6s and 7.8s. So you just have to make the call that works for you. Around ponds, for me, 7 to 7.3 is plenty big. I have some rods that aren't necessarily frog rods that I will fish everything on. And sometimes I'm out there and I don't have my frog rod and I want to fish a frog, so I throw on my little frog. That's the other reason I like the I'm a Frog, is it allows me to fish it on a little lighter gear, and it doesn't make it any more difficult for me to get a hookup. Whereas if I fished a bigger frog, I'd be a little more worried about trying to get the hook set with lighter gear. So this is a really versatile frog for me. It casts well on the equipment that I use. So you might want to try to get one of these. They're hard to come by. They stopped making them. They're about $14 to $17 on eBay. I don't know that I'll try to leave a link to some of these for you. But if you can get a couple of these, they're nice to have around, at least try them. But you might be like Pat and you don't care for them a whole lot. The other one that's really, really good is the Kyera. This frog is compact, almost as small as the one that I use. And it has shorter legs. But what it does do way better than this is it walks. So you can just give a little tip twitch and the thing will turn back and forth. And that walking motion sometimes is the only thing that will catch bass on a frog for a given day. And Pat and I have proven that point a few times fishing, where he's caught 2, 3, 4 fish to my 1. And then all of a sudden I'm like, you know what, give me that Kyera. And I start throwing it out there and it works. And then there's days that I'm blowing it out on the I'm a Frog. So it really, like I said, it's up here. Most of the time, the baits you're using, if you believe they're going to work, if you can take out the distrust in your lure and you can focus on your action and your casting, well, you've taken out one of the weak points in your game. Because if you're sitting there, like I say, if you're sitting there thinking that whatever you're using isn't the right one, or it's not good enough, or it's too big, or it's too small, then you're already halfway there to losing a fish, because you're just not believing that a fish is even going to hit necessarily. Okay, so we've covered the frogs. We've got popping frogs. We've got kicking frogs. We've got frogs with legs. We've got walking frogs. We've got compact frogs. We've got frogs that aren't even frogs, that look like mice. And we've talked about rods, bait caster, 30-pound braid and up, and medium heavy fast or heavy fast rod, 7 feet or above. I'd like to see 7.1 to 7.3. So that's pretty much the basics for me for frogs. Let's talk about the anatomy of a hook set. It would probably be easier to show you on the water, but since I'm sitting here, I'll just walk you through kind of how I approach it. So you throw the frog out there, it's on the water. First thing you want to do after you cast, let the rings dissipate. Just give it a second to sit. Sometimes the fish scare off on the splash and then they'll come back out of curiosity. And you'd probably be surprised if you could drain the pond every time you cast a frog, what would be sitting underneath it looking at it. And you don't know how many times that when you just start working a frog right after the cast, you might have just pulled it right out of the hot spot and you don't even know it. So good thing to do. And I'm guilty of this. I often will cast the frog, start working it right back out towards me, and I lose the time that I probably should let it sit there and mature a little bit in the spot. But anyway, cast it out there, let it hit, let the rings dissipate. Then give it a 1 or a 2, just kind of give it some motion. And then that way you're going to attract anything that might be sitting there thinking, I'm going to bite this thing. And if you give it a little bit of life, sometimes that's all it takes. And then you let it sit for a second or two, and then you might give it a 1, 2, 3, let it sit. And you might give it a 1, 2, let it sit, and a 1, 2, 3, let it sit. And usually when it sits, they either hit it right when it sits for a little longer time frame. Like sometimes I'll drop my phone or I'll drop my scissors and I'll bend over to do something and then reel up the slack and then look back up to start fishing. and it's been sitting there for like 30 seconds. And as soon as I move it the next time, I get a hit. I've noticed that many, many times. So I'm a true believer in the pause. It is hard to do. It's a really hard thing to practice and to get good at is patience, but it's worth it if you can leave them sit for a long time. You'll get more strikes. But then it's the readiness. It's really the readiness. Like, you have to believe the frog you're using is going to get eaten. You have to expect the big blow up because it's coming. Because whether you've had one yet or not, you will eventually get a giant blow up on a frog, and it will scare the crap out of you because it's so violent. You know, it's like a great white hitting a seal, except much smaller. And so you throw this thing out there, you get that huge blow up. And the first thing you want to see is you want to kind of make sure that it got it. Because a lot of times you'll see these fish just slam it. And then you go to set the hook and it just comes flying back at you at 100 miles an hour and you never even felt the fish. And you're like, what the heck? A lot of times they just miss. Most of the times they don't, but a lot of times they'll miss. So sometimes I'll just pause and I want to see it gone and I'll see my line kind of diving or going left or right. Don't panic because just because your line's moving down, it's not like they're going to know right away, oh, that's a plastic frog, I'm not going to eat it. A lot of times they come up, they suck it in, they take it down, and you've got a half step or a second to set that hook. So what I like to do is make sure they've got it, and then I'll give it a crank. Like, this is all one motion. I'll make sure they've got it, and I'll be cranking my rod tip down towards the bait. And when I get the tip down towards the bait, I just jack it. And I usually, I think I'm kind of a 2 to 8. I'm not a straight up over my head. I'm more of a over my left shoulder, kind of like if you were throwing, water over your shoulder out of a bale. Just imagine you have something in your hand and you just go as hard as you can. And you really smack it. You hit it hard. And you'll know, like, when you hook up on a fish, it'll stop coming back. It's not like you're going to yank the fish. Like, sometimes you'll yank a little one right out of the water. But when they're 30 yards out and they're 2.5, 3 pounds, he's not coming out of that water. You're going to wham it. Your rod's going to bend over and you're going to know you've got a hook set. What you don't want to do is see it go under and just start reeling in, and start fighting the fish. He might get caught on the tip of the hook, but as soon as he shakes once or twice, he comes right off. And I used to do that all the time. You would lose your train of thought. You wouldn't think about it. Just remember, the most important thing is the hook set. You have to set the hook. I can tell people that, and they'll go fish with me, and they'll still blow the hook set. It's just a hard thing to get used to. It just doesn't seem to make sense that you have to do it that hard. But when you get them in, you usually only have like 1 or 2 hooks, in them, and it's not even in that far. And you think, wow, I really hit it hard and it still didn't go in that far. That's just the way it goes. That's the way the frogs work. So yeah, pick a frog you're confident in. Pick a color that you think will work. Don't make colors difficult. Black, white. That's it, man. I'm telling you. Pat and I giggle and laugh all the time. We have all different colors, whole rainbow range of colors of frogs. Sometimes they'll react to orange or yellow, but most of the time, if it's black or white, we split our difference when we go fishing early in the morning. I'm like, what are you using? He goes, I got a black one. I'm like, all right, I'll throw a white one on. He catches 2 fish. I'm like, all right, I'll change to black. I catch 2 fish. He'll say, all right, I changed to white. Put our feet on both sides of the fence to try to figure out what they're going to do. But usually black and white frogs is the way to go. And also natural. It's like if you're fishing in high sun and you've got a lot of light and they can see color, then maybe just a real natural looking frog is perfect. But don't get too crazy about it. Don't try buy pink and yellows and purples. And, if you like them, cool. But black and white and natural really is all you need. Like, I don't have a black one here, but I would say all these would qualify as white. And these right here, maybe even that one and this one would qualify as a natural color. Some frogs are lighter, some frogs are darker, some have yellow bellies, some have white bellies. This one makes no sense. And remember, just because you're using a bait that's called a frog doesn't mean that the fish thinks every time that it's eating a frog. This could easily be, to them, a bluegill on top of the water dying. They're not necessarily that brilliant. So don't be afraid to throw a frog when they're hitting maybe bait fish or something out in the middle of the water and their topwater smashing and the popper or something's not working, even though the popper would probably be the best bet in that case. But you can throw a frog and, that sometimes they emulate mice or they emulate bluegill that are on top of the water. So don't get lost too much in the details and try to figure out what the fish thinks they are. As long as the fish hit them, you're happy. So pick the one you like. Pick the one that makes you feel most confident fishing it. Use 30-pound braid, a bait caster, and a 7-foot or above rod with a medium heavy fast or a heavy fast action. You want to set the hook, man. Set it hard and bring them home and have fun. I mean, frog fishing is fun. So, and keep trying. You're going to miss a lot. That's the thing about frog fishing. Out of 6 fish, you'll miss 3, whereas a popper, you'd catch them all. The 3 that you do catch, and you usually catch bigger fish on frogs. Usually the big boys will come after the big frogs. And don't think that just because you're using a small frog, you're not going to catch a big fish. I've caught 5-6 pounders on this little guy, and I've caught 3/4 pounders on these big frogs. They just do different things. And if you're thinking about the size of a fish mouth, that right there is about the size of a 2-pound bass. Okay? That's the small frog. Now let's take the big frog. Again, 2-pound bass. That is nothing for a 2-pound bass to munch on. That's easy. If you wanted to see like a 5-pound bass, their mouth can be like bigger than this. So, I mean, don't think that these things are too big. Don't let it head case you that you're fishing this big heavy lure and it's casting a mile and you're thinking there's nothing in here that could eat that. There absolutely is. A 2-pound bass will cream all of these. A 1.5-pound bass has no problem with these. A 5-pound bass could eat 3 at a time. So don't hesitate to throw frogs. Try them. You'll like them. I promise. It's the way to go. Plus, we're coming into really good frog season. We're late summer, getting into early fall. It's going to start cooling down. Topwater frogging in the fall. Oh my God, nothing like it. You guys have fun. I'll talk to you later. Just wanted to run through some frog talk. Take care. Bye.